All right, I believe we're live. Let me check and see. Okay. There's a commercial happening on the other side on YouTube. Oh, we have people. In the chat, can you guys say if you see me, if you hear me, and I can get started? All right. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to American Shade. I'm Brittany King, your host, and tonight we are going live and diving right back into the conversation on race identity and racelessness and what racial reconciliation can look like in America. But before I go on, I'm going to bring on Sheena really quickly. Sheena, here we go. Are you ready? Hello again.
Hello, I'm so ready.
Hello. All right. So last Friday, Dr. Sheena Mason, the founder of the theory of racelessness, was in conversation with me for literally 3 hours. Like, are you recovered from that? Like, that was great though. I loved it. And just to refresh everyone's memories, Sheena believes America needs to become raceless in order to racially reconcile, and that race itself is racist and is racism. I believe race is inevitably here to stay, and challenging our implicit biases is what we should strive to destroy. And tonight we are joined with 6 dynamic and insightful panelists who are proponents for either racelessness or race identity. But before I bring them on, Sheena, can you briefly tell us what theory of racelessness is very quickly for those that didn't catch our conversation?
Yeah, so there are 6 philosophies of race that are not commonly heard of. I speak from a place of eliminativism, which speaks to what I think should be done with the idea of race, which is, yes, eliminate it. And my skepticism, my other philosophical viewpoint is that race doesn't actually exist, but that society imagines that it does as a social construction, yada, yada, yada. So that's the short end of it. And the theory of racelessness is inspired by these other philosophical positions and primarily educating people on these positions.
Okay, awesome. So now we're going to bring on our panelists. I'm going to do this as dramatic as I can. So I'm going to bring on each person one by one. And I'm just going to ask you to just briefly tell us a little bit about what you do and why you are either for racelessness or race identity. And if we can keep it to like 1 to 2 minutes so we can like move on with the discussion, that'd be great. So I'm going to bring on first person. Steve, go ahead. I just said your name, so I guess you don't have to. But
yeah. So I'm Steve Jordan. I'm an automotive mechanic of 2.5 decades. Just kind of a regular guy and read a lot on my spare time. And, you know, I wrench all day at work, so all I've got is time to listen to audiobooks. So I go through about 150 books a year. So it's really, it's really fun. It's really fun. Like I'm not going to admit how much money I've spent on Audible. So, but I have a rule, like, if I love the book enough, I'll buy it in paper. And so I've just been slowly amassing this library of really amazing works. And so I hope to add Dr. Sheena's to my collection. So just waiting for it to come out. But no, I am definitely for racelessness. I watched your guys' conversation, that 3-hour conversation, and what she said really spoke to me. What Dr. Sheena said really spoke to me, because I've been trying to figure out a way to describe how I feel about race and racial identity and how I interact with that as a white guy. And it's really difficult, because it seems like today's society, we can't really bounce ideas off of each other in a meaningful way where it doesn't devolve into yelling and name calling and insults and ad hominem attacks and all sorts of different stuff. It's just so hard to have conversations, which is why I'm so absolutely blessed to be able to be here and be able to talk to you guys. And really looking forward to both learning and being able to explain my position on race.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. So I'm going to bring on the next person. What up, Kimi? Tell us about yourself.
Hey guys, my name is Kimi. I work in the music industry behind the scenes, but I'm an artist and a YouTuber, and I am standing on the pro-race identity side. The reasons being is that I believe that there are certain definitions and terms that might not necessarily align with just identifying as Black as a skin color. And in order to accept oneself fully, skin color and where you fall in that spectrum does fall into that. And kind of finding your own self outside of the noise of everything else. I believe that if we create a raceless society, we are creating the breeding grounds to reclassify ourselves based on the characteristics we notice amongst skin color groups. And I also don't really support self-censorship or giving words or labels too much power. I believe we should be able to integrate white, Black without having any offense or feeling misidentified with that. So yeah, that's my stance.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So now I'm going to bring on, see if I can get to him. Samuel?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what side of this conversation you're on?
Yes. I'm Samuel Say. I'm a blogger, and I believe I'm the only Canadian here. But I'm moving into America soon, but happy to be talking to you guys. Yeah, so I was born originally in Ghana, West Africa, and I moved to Canada. And I blog at slowtowrite.com. I'm a Christian blogger, so I blog about all these issues from a Christian perspective. And on the issue, I am on the racelessness side. This is because, and I guess I'll start off with a bang. This is because I disagree with white supremacists. In that our modern view of race was created and justified by white supremacists to defend and justify slavery. And before that, the modern concept of race did not exist. So I reject that, and I agree with my maker. I agree with God that we are all made in the image of God from Adam and Eve. Every single person can trace their lineage to Adam and Eve. And then I also agree with science that there is no biological difference between all humanity. So therefore, I reject the race identity thinking, and I embrace the racelessness side of this issue.
Awesome. Thank you. And now I'm going to bring on Khadija. What up, girl?
Hi.
How are you? Hey, what's good?
Not much. As Brittany said, my name is Khadija Mbowe. Sam, I'm actually Canadian as well. I'm Canadian and American. I've lived in both countries for extended periods of time, but my ancestral line is from Gambia and West Africa, so we've got a few things in common there. And I am for the race identity side because I think that as children growing up, you know, we are socialized in this world to see race and the implications of it. But as children, we also have powers of observation, and we can notice when people look just a little bit different from us or seem different or act different and stuff. And so to me, I'm about embracing that difference and leaning into it and knowing, hey, okay, we're not going to see the same or be the same because this part of my identity, because again, I don't think that what did Cornel West say? I love Blackness, but not enough to blind me. I'm not only a Black person. So I do understand that this part of my identity is going to cause me to think differently from somebody else, but it does not mean that we can't use those differences to cultivate an interesting relationship or to understand the greater world around us. I did get to watch y'all's conversation, and the thing I think I appreciated the most about it was just the tackling of systemic oppression because of racism. You know, I don't know what I'd be philosophically, to be honest, so maybe you can tell me that later. But I really do believe that we can't confront problems by not fully addressing them. And I'm not suggesting that that's what the concept is. I'm sure you'll explain it even more. This is just based off my minimal understanding of it. But yeah, sorry. I hope that was articulate.
It was. It was beautiful. Yes.
Okay.
Made all the sense. All right. So we got that. Thank you, girl. And we're going to bring on Will now. Will, you ready?
Yeah. Hi.
Awesome. What up?
Oh, it's so nice to be here. My name is Will Reusch. I'm a high school teacher in Los Angeles. I've been teaching for like 15 years, very diverse populations in Los Angeles. I'm such a fence sitter. Like, I don't know really where I stand on this stuff. And I have convictions, but I want to really get my ducks in a row and really like get through it all before I'm like, oh, this is where I stand. And I'm still all over this. Like what Khadija just said, you know, I love the differences. I married into a different culture and race and stuff like that. And most of my kids' friends are biracial. So you see like the positives of that. I know that's different than ethnicity. I don't know, but I'm here to kind of be a part of this conversation. I think it seems like a lot of just really open-minded people with diverse perspectives. And that's so awesome. So I don't know. I'm going to probably develop it while I'm here.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Hold on. I'm trying to get to you. Okay. And Dr. Carter, I'm going to bring you on. Hello.
How are you?
Good. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what side you're on, racelessness or race identity? I hate saying side you're on, but you know what I mean.
I can tell you that my name is Jacoby Carter. I'm a chair of the Department of Philosophy at Howard University. I work on African American philosophy, the philosophy of Elaine Locke, and philosophy of race. I suppose it's going to come out that I'm on the side of racelessness, primarily because I hold to the view that races are thoroughly pernicious categories. There's nothing positive or beneficial about being racialized in any context. And for that reason, I think the best thing we could do, if at all possible, is to eliminate them. I'll hasten to say that a raceless world, on the understanding that I have of race, is not a monolithic world. The position of racial elimination that I take is not one that means to do away with diversity. I advocate and champion diversity. But race has never done anything other than victimize and subjugates populations of human beings.
All right. Well, thank you. That was a mic drop. Okay, I'm going to remove everyone. And just to clarify, which I think I did, and I think everyone that is going to be on the side of race identity doesn't see being racialized as a positive thing, but as an inevitable thing. That is what we see. So let's just put that out there. Now, I'm just going to let the viewers know, I thought in the StreamYard that I can bring on all of our guests at once. So what is going to happen is I'm going to pose a question, or Dr. Sheena will pose a question, and our panelists will have questions too. And I'm just going to bring on the people that have answers to the question, and then we're going to go on from there. Okay. All right. So, and this might be for everyone. I'm sure everyone has something to say with this. Just as an icebreaker, some of you touched upon this, but I'm just wanting to know, after hearing Sheena and my conversation, what were some of your initial thoughts or reactions? Was there anything that stood out in particular? Was there any aha moments that you had? And if you do have those, can you type in the chat if you want to say something? Or raise your hand. I can see everyone. Okay, hold on. All right. Dr. Carter?
Well, first I would say that I am never cease to be amazed by how amazing and wonderful this woman is. It's been a real pleasure knowing her, and that I may have played some small role in that is brings a smile to my face. But yeah, one of the things that I think it's important to drive home, I was sort of saying this in the introduction, is the idea that the kind of racelessness that I take Sheena to advocate, and that I myself advocate, is not one of some kind of psychological disposition of hating oneself or wanting to disabuse oneself from their ethnic particularity. It's not that. It's an understanding that on any plausible view, what we understand by race is a scientifically debunked and historically inaccurate and misguided conception about the biological signification of populations and the way in which those biological markers are supposed to track cultural formations. We know this in these days. I mean, there's volumes and volumes of scholarship that tell us that that's false. And then the idea becomes, well, look, if we understand about race that it isn't what we've been told that it is, and it isn't what we oftentimes falsely believe it is, what's the best thing we can do about the phenomenon, knowing that it still exists, right? There is something that it means to be racialized a certain way in lots of contexts around the world. And that I thought that came out beautifully in the conversation, and talked around some of the edges there. And I'm sure we'll get more into it today, but I think it's an important conversation to have.
All right, Khadija.
Yeah, I think when I initially heard the concept, I was like, what are we doing here? You know, like how everyone always has the side eye. And as someone who prides myself on learning more about critical thinking, I always, if I hear something, I'm like, okay, let's see what's going on before I just agree, you know. I think in the conversation, the part that I had found very interesting was when you were both talking about your previous experiences, when you, as a lot of people will maybe relate to this, the first time you found out you were Black, let's say, or knew that you were a racialized person because of what somebody else said to you. And it caused me to reflect. And the first thing that I thought was, I actually didn't know I was Black before I knew I was dark-skinned. Oddly enough, and I know colorism is a whole other conversation, but I think there's something to weave into that. And what Brittany was saying earlier, I'm somebody who believes that implicit bias is a natural knee-jerk reaction. It's not everything, and it can be mitigated, but I do think it is something that a lot of us are becoming more aware of in terms of how we interact. And I'm also a proponent of, contradict your ideas because human beings, there's the belief that you can't, labels only go so far, words and the naming of things only go so far, but at the same time, it's good to name things to bring that to light. And so I think even if there was this perfect world, this egalitarian maybe society of people understanding difference and doing away with race because we know it isn't real, there's always, in my mind, the thing that I'm having a hang up about is that humans are always going to find ways to feel superior to another, you know, and I'm a spiritual person, so I find that that's wrapped up in ego as well. If you are sure of who you are and what you walk in, you don't need to feel better than somebody else based off of arbitrary ideas, but not everyone thinks in that way. So that's where I think my biggest, I guess hang up is about this concept. And I'm curious to know if it's maybe because I'm either misunderstanding or misrepresenting it, or if I'm getting it right, but maybe that's something that we can discuss further, I guess.
Yeah. If I could just share, I've taught, like I said, I taught in different environments, and some of the schools were 0% white. And then other schools were very, very diverse. But what I found, and Brittany, I think you and I have talked about this, is if I reflect back, maybe it's 12 years ago, and you say what about, Janessa, what race was she? I'm like, oh man, I got to think about it. Was she Mexican? Was she Black? I don't even know. Once you're around all these diverse people, you start to become more I guess, lack of a better term, colorblind. And that makes me think that it's possible. It's, you see people's skin color initially, and then you might have prejudices about that or whatever. But once you get to know individuals, then it becomes more about their personality. So I don't know if it's impossible to get there. I also know that little children, I'm aware of the Clark doll test and stuff like that. But I think it's more complex than the initial findings of that suggested. I think that a lot of little kids, they don't see race, especially if they're around diverse people. My kids are half Filipino, half white, and they're like, do I look like Michael Jordan wearing this? I'm like, yeah, buddy, you do. They don't connect those things. And because I've done it myself, as I walk into a classroom and I see all of maybe it's all Hispanic kids or all Black kids. I'm like, whoa, okay, that's something different. And then very soon you see them for their personalities because you get to know them. So that gives me hope that the stuff that Dr. Sheena, you're talking about, like, is possible. I just don't know how to get there with people who are generationally and just for so long kind of locked into seeing people according to those groups. I don't know how to get there, but I do believe that it's possible.
Howdy. So I apologize. I'm terribly nervous. I'm in a room with a bunch of really amazing and intelligent people. So I think what struck me the most when I was listening to both of you speak and what Dr. Mason was explaining was, you know, if I can speak from, you know, the common Joe type of guy, I think to say that when people say I'm colorblind, it's not actually that we don't see color. We absolutely do. Our hope is that we also see the struggles that Black folk go through. We see, you know, the systemic racism that has occurred, redlining, HUD housing discrimination, you know, especially what trans and gay Black folk have had to deal with. Like, there's a lot there to unpackage. And that is also something that we commonly, it goes through our mind immediately if we're aware of it. And this is going to speak to Will here in just a second. We're very well aware of the challenges that affect people of color. And when we say that we don't see color, it means that we're not going to treat you any differently than we would treat anybody else. We're going to treat you with dignity, with respect, with grace. But it's not going to, hopefully, govern the way that we behave and talk to you as a human being. And much like Will, you know, I'm very much on the fence here. I chose racelessness because I tend to lean a little bit more towards that direction. But the thing that I got from your guys' discussion was that it's okay for me to see color and to see and to respect color, but not make it something that is so just out there and you know, so to speak, that we can't have conversations without, how would you put it? It's like you can't have really good conversations when there's an elephant in the room that nobody's acknowledging, right? And that keeps conversations from happening. So it's much easier for me to just to tell people, you know, I respect who you are, and let's continue on with the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I insert something real quick? When
Absolutely.
you say someone doesn't see color, or like you said, like you realized from our conversation that it's okay to see color, do you mean like actually my brown skin, or do you mean race, Black? I'm just trying to clarify, because I have an answer, I think, too.
It's, you know, it's hard to say. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I don't see the difference between those two things.
And that was
like,
my point. Yeah. I think that was my point, that race, that skin signifies someone's race. If you see me or Khadija, and she said that she is not even like from America necessarily, and I am, it doesn't matter that. It matters that she looks Black, I look Black. So we're inside Black. The thing with me is I see what happened with race. Unfortunate. It's not good to be racialized at all. I'm not a proponent for like, let's keep on being white and Black. It's more of, this is just an inevitable reality, and like Khadija said, not to act on impulse of implicit biases on someone, and to go through and to judge people by someone's character the way Will was talking about. So yeah, what you're saying, I get, and I've heard this a lot. It is no problem that you see me as a brown person, or you see me as a Black person, as in context of race. But the issue is, how do you see me? That's the thing that I'm trying to challenge. It's not that I don't care if that you see me as Black, because there's nothing wrong with me being Black. It's, how do you see me? Do you see me through the lens of an implicit biases, or do you see me as just, okay, she's another person? And you are going to get to the character. That is what it is.
I can answer that a little bit. So what it basically is that's kind of the main ground level assumptions that we can make when we interact with people for the first time, right? So we can assume that someone, you know, if they look like you or you look like me, we can make certain assumptions, and hopefully those assumptions aren't guided by racial bias, right, or implicit biases. So when I look at someone who's Black, I immediately understand and am very well aware that there's certain challenges they face every day, and that I need to be mindful of my voice. I need to be respectful, and I think that's about the best way I can put it.
Yeah. And I think while you're talking, Kimi wanted to chime in. So, Kimi, what did you want to say?
I had a question regarding racelessness, the theory of racelessness. Dr. Sheena, like, what is the difference between taking a colorblind approach versus racelessness? Because I also just want to address the fact that Johann Blumenbach's definitions of race are not what we necessarily identify with today. And I could read those out. That's Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. And those are not necessarily the labels that we use. So I'm just curious to know, like, I believe we're already kind of on a slope away from those human distinctions. So what is the difference between the theory of racelessness and colorblindness?
Well, I think it's unfortunate, and I think this is kind of to Steve's point. It's unfortunate that colorblindness has taken such a negative stigma, right? Because these, ultimately, we're talking about usually well-intentioned people who are, I think, operating from a place of not trying to support their own potential biases or other people's biases, but then getting caught in the quagmire of making it seem like they're not recognizing differences, they're ignoring differences, and all this other stuff. So I say that to say that in that way, I understand your question to be asking me, how is my theory, I didn't invent it, this theory like exists already, right? How is it different from colorblindness in a very particular way, in that many people associate colorblindness with ignoring racism? I think that has become the sort of central pushback against dialogue that uses the word colorblindness, or even in this instance, racelessness. It's this idea that some people who profess to be colorblind are also intentionally or otherwise ignoring or sort of like refusing to acknowledge the existence and persistence of racism. So in that way, I draw a clear delineation between what I am advocating for, what I'm saying, my ideas, all of that stuff, from that sort of problematic spice flavor of colorblindness. But outside of that very important distinction, I don't know that it's different. I think it hits differently because colorblindness, Coleman Hughes said something eloquent probably a year ago in a talk. It gets this sort of faulty assumption that people are talking about literally not perceiving differences, not perceiving skin color, not perceiving what is thought to be race. But the ironic thing is, as Dr. Carter was kind of mentioning earlier, in a society that racializes people, that racialization is nefarious and it enacts violence onto people. The violence is that of racism. And so the theory of racism is not about let's pretend that people aren't different. Actually, it's about elevating and privileging the fact that people are different. That people are different, that skin tone, skin color does not signify sameness in culture, in linguistics, religion, nationality, like any of that, that we are actually different. In race, the concept, the language of race, being racialized really prevents in a lot of problematic ways the recognition of actual differences, and I'll say actual similarities, in ways that at this juncture, centuries into the mix, to me seems less practical for us to try to undo all of that and make it so it's not so. And it seems actually more practical to work toward elimination, not in a utopic way. I love that Khadija used the word utopic earlier. That's not what Dr. Carter and us eliminativists, that's not what we're advocating for. We recognize that there's going to be hierarchy, that we cannot get people in any population to 100% agree about any topic, much less this particular topic, right? But I think that we can definitely aim for the statistical majority, and we're not starting at zero. There are more people who are thinking along the lines of Dr. Carter and I, both historically and today, who are aligned with this idea of working toward a raceless society because of their foundational understanding of what race is in society, how it connects to racism and that sort of thing. So I hope that answers your question, Kimmy. And I'm glad you asked the question because it's an important distinction, because there is a distinction.
Mm-hmm. And I love that we clarified that, because that was going to be a question down the line. Since we're on colorblindness, I'm just going to ask this question out because I'm loving this conversation right now. And then Sam, I'm going to get to you. But so we just heard what Dr. Sheena said. Does anyone else have any other commentary on colorblindness? Do you think colorblindness is wrong? Do you think colorblindness is right? Okay. Steve? Okay.
Yeah. So.
Oh, hold on. Oh, you're there. Okay, go ahead.
Yep. So I think Dr. Mason really touched on something that I didn't, that I really want to make clear too, is that in no way, shape, or form does the view of being colorblind in any way give you escape from culpability of complicity. So you don't get to make the excuse that you just didn't read it. I mean, there's thousands of books on the Black experience. I went to school. I never learned about W.E.B. Du Bois. I just barely read him last year, and I'm 44 years old. Right. So I've got a lot of making up to do. Just because you don't see color does not mean that you are not responsible for searching out institutions of racism and destroying them. So I don't want anybody to misunderstand when I say I don't see color as being an excuse not to see racism. And I think that's an incredibly valid point. And I'm grateful that you brought that up.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to chime in on this because, and I definitely, I think with the conversation that Coleman Hughes and I had, I think it was last year, and we've had other talks, definitely liked his point about, color blindness isn't about not seeing color. Like, we all can see color. When people tell me like they're colorblind or they don't see race, I know they don't mean they don't see my brown skin. Like, I know they don't say that. But I think the claim to me, in a sense, might be automatically false, because it's like you see it, but why are you denying seeing it is my question. But you guys really fleshed it out for me. Though I think when people are saying that I don't see, when people say I'm not colorblind, to me, what I'm hearing is I don't see the implicit biases attached to your skin color or your race. Mm-hmm. Or I don't believe the implicit biases attached to your skin color or race. And I think there's a difference between saying see and believe, because the latter implies you acknowledge it and you're actively not going to judge me or whoever else upon stereotypes or biases. So that's my take. It's a tricky thing because I've had tons of conversations with people in good faith, and they'll say that, and I know they mean it in a positive way, and I just take it kind of as a positive thing because I know what they mean. But other people that I have conversations with utilize that phrase to completely dismiss conversations on race. So that's why it's sometimes hard to know people's intent behind when they use it. So that's my take on colorblindness. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have something else? Oh, Okay, we're gonna have Samuel. He has something that he wants to say about the debate, and then we're gonna bring in Dr. Carter. He has something else he wants to say.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the debate and this conversation. I've not finished the debate yet. It's 3 hours long, so I've not gone through yet. But I'm really enjoying it. And I mentioned that because you guys disagree, but you disagreed very well, and I really appreciate that. On these issues, it's usually very contentious and it leads to a lot of animosity, and I really appreciate it. And even in this conversation, I've heard a lot of things that I agree with and a lot of things that I disagree with, but yet I love that, right? And I almost want to just kind of sit back and grab a beer and just enjoy this thing. So that's really, again, I will share some of my thoughts later, but I just wanted to mention that as I'm grateful that I get to participate in this conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Carter?
Yes, just quickly, I would add about the colorblindness debate. Colorblindness, as I understand it, is a psychological justificatory mechanism for white liberalism. Right. This is why we have such difficulty with the concept, right? So colorblindness, like you've already said, immediately that when a person says that or that that's what they are, that they don't mean that they don't see your color. And probably you disbelieve them even if they want to suggest that it means that they don't see your race or ethnic makeup, right? Because here's one thing about racism. Race is an ambient phenomenon. It's literally in the air, right? We exist in a racial and a racialized medium. Particularly in the context of the United States, for a person to say that they don't see race would be like a person saying, I don't understand what a stop sign means. I mean, we exist in a racialized social context. You understand the meaning of race the same way you understand the meaning of Mississippi or Connecticut. Like, those are states. They've got geographic boundaries that have been codified by laws and other human edicts, right? You understand what it is we're talking about when we say these things, right? And the reason why we get into these conceptual difficulties with something like colorblindness is because we don't recognize that what it's really there for. It's there as a way to give psychological ease to a liberal white consciousness that's guilty about its complicity in a racialized social order. I don't want to keep yammering on, so I'll just.
I was like, that's a mic drop moment, but I was like, I'm not cutting it off. I mean, let's keep going.
Sorry if you don't mind, Doctor, would you mind repeating that again? I know it was a mic drop, but I want to hear it again so I can fully understand what you're saying.
Yeah, so what I'm suggesting is that what colorblindness is a psychological coping mechanism for liberal white guilt, right? It's a way for me to be able to say, I'm not complicit in systemic structures of racism because I don't see color. What do you mean by that? You can't see this? Of course you do. Well, what do you mean? You don't understand that I'm a person who's racialized as Black? Well, that's got definite meanings, right? I'm ascribed to and codified in a society that marks me out as a fitting victim for a police officer to shoot to death, for instance, when I've committed no crime without legal ramification, right? It means something tangible, something significant to be racialized in a social context. And that socialization is something that everyone who exists in that context is knowledgeable of. Racism is something that we learn. We teach it to people. You cannot exist in the context of the United States and not have or come to an understanding of race. Right? And so it is a way of denying what they're complicit in.
But I think the reason why I guess I asked that, and I guess I would respond to that with a question, which is, if someone like me, a Black man, were to say that I am colorblind, what would be your interpretation of what I just said?
I don't understand what you mean. Say it to me in other words.
If I were to say that I don't see color, what would you think that I meant by that?
I mean, that sounds like a medical condition.
Well, the reason why I'm saying that is because we say a lot of things, but we don't mean those things literally, right? And I think so when someone says that, as I believe Dr. Sheena Mason was saying earlier, that if you're saying that, it's a phrasing which is not literal. I mean, I don't think anyone can literally say that. Anyone can truly say that, right? So I think in the same way that I would give that benefit of, well, I would be gracious to a Black man saying I don't see color, knowing they're not speaking literally, I would also want to give that grace to a white man when they say that too, right?
Yeah,
because
so
then,
I understand that it's not a literal statement, and I'm being a little flippant, Sam. So I mean, if I'm going to be straightforward about it, what I would say is this: I'm no psychologist, right? But for a person of color to say to me, "I'm colorblind," I'd want to interrogate them and get at what that means, right? And so, look, if what I've said before has any shot at all at being accurate, there's nothing about something being the expression of a psychological disposition to try to alleviate white liberal guilt that says that only a white person can have that psychological disposition, right? Because another thing that we need to appreciate about racism is that it not only racializes in the sense of marks out populations as the fitting objects of oppression and subjugation, it causes the internalization of that subjugation and that oppression by the people that it so demarcates, right? So a person can be of the opinion that race, seeing race, being raced is something I should feel guilty about, even when they are the victims of that very social process. And then they might profess things like, I don't see color. Because to say the opposite, to be seeing color, seems to me a more straightforward admission of my complicity in a system that I don't really stand behind.
I think the trouble with that, though, is that speaking of implicit bias, I think that comes with a lot of bias for a lot of the white people that would say that, right? That it would bring in already an accepted view as to what they must mean when they're saying that. I think it's true that there would be some white people that would say that, right? There's some white people that would want to justify their own racism by saying that. But I think in of itself, the phrasing is already subjective, right? That it could mean anything. Now, I understand, again, because I want to be as a writer, I very much appreciate being very clear and being very specific. So I don't really use colorblind. I wouldn't use that phrase. But I understand that historically, it's only been recently that there's been a lot of pushback against it, and I think rightly so, because I want to celebrate colors, right? I want to celebrate that we have different colors. So I agree with you there. But I think that we make a mistake if, and I see what you're doing, and I appreciate a lot of what you're saying, but I think that we make a mistake if we assume that if a white person is saying this, or that even if most people are saying this, they're saying it to justify their own racism.
Well, maybe not their own racism, but their complicity in racism, right? I mean, so one may not be overtly engaged in acts that perpetuate a racist regime, but maybe complicit in them. But I would say a couple of other things, Sam, and I'll try to be quick about this, right? So if someone were to say to me that I think of myself as colorblind, the other thing I would say is, well, look, why are you so comfortable with doing violence to meaningful difference, right? Difference that matters to people. Right. So if what I'm saying when I'm colorblind is I treat everybody the same, regardless of any other information that I have about them. Well, why do we suppose that what the correct view is that we should treat everybody the same? Sam, if you and I were running a race and the judge fired the gun and said, Sam, stay on the line, and he let me run 20 yards and then he made me stop and he said, all right, Sam, from here on out, I'm going to treat y'all the same. And he starts the race again. It's a 100-yard dash. Do you think that you've been treated fairly? Do you think that any meaningful judgments or assessment of the race that transpired between the two of us should fail to account for the fact that I got a 20-yard head start over you? Right. And so what I would say to a colorblind person is, in a society that has a deep and abiding and undeniable history of victimization and the generation of privilege, wealth, political power, as a result of that victimization, what are you really saying to the inheritors of that victimization when you say you don't see the victimization that they've been subjected to?
Mm-hmm. I don't want to own this conversation, but I think just as a reply to that, I think that assumes, well, so one thing, actually, before I mention this part, if somebody is complicit in racism, then they are guilty of racism, right?
No, I don't want to make that assumption. You're correct to point that out. That would be a faulty assumption. Complicity does not make one guilty necessarily.
I would say so, right? That if you are being complicit. If you are allowing for racism, if you are, I mean, I guess it depends on maybe how you want to define the word complicit, right? But I would say if you are approving of it, if you are okay with it, if you are not standing against it, then that means then you are for it as well. If you're not standing against it, you're for it. So if someone's complicit in racism, then they're also then being racist as well too. But that could just be a matter of semantics in many ways. But I think even with your second example about the race, I think that deals with a lot of assumptions too. The reality is, I'm assuming on this panel that not everyone actually agrees that there's. I mean, with your analogy, that would mean that we believe that there is. Forgetting the name, how you phrase the person overseeing the race, that it assumes that we believe that there is right now ongoing systemic racism against Black people in America or in Canada. And not all of us, including myself, would agree with that, right? So there's so many assumptions already at play here that I think we might need to address before we deal with what someone possibly means when they say that they are colorblind.
Does anyone else have anything to say with that? Kimi?
Oh. Dr. Sheena, you can respond.
Thank you so much, Kimi. I'll be brief. Yeah, Sam, this is enlightening in a lot of ways, not because it's a new information for me, but because it's also something that I try to get at in my conversations with people and in my own, scholarship and thinking is like, what does it mean that that there's a certain, I don't know, there are certain ways of thinking that categorize or sort of in a lot of ways define the Black experience as being one in which is entrenched in dealing with racism, systemic and otherwise, right? But there are a lot of people who are racialized as Black in different spaces who actually disagree that racism is systemic, or that they disagree. Like there's actually, Kimi, you were a guest on this channel. It's like Critical African Thinkers channel. He's bringing his own perspective to this conversation, and he disagrees that racism is systemic in the context of America, and so that does, for me, I think, complicate the discourse because, and I think that is why Dr. Carter and I point to the category of race as being as pernicious as it is, because it does wash over meaningful differences and meaningful similarities as well. But like, especially differences in thought, differences in skin color does not equate with differences in thought, differences in being, differences in culture and nationality and all of those things. And there are plenty of people who are racialized as Black who just see things differently, right? They can have exactly the same information as somebody like myself or somebody like Dr. Carter, who are pointing to racism as a thing, as being systemic, et cetera, and still come to conclude that indeed racism is not systemic. And then where do we go? Like, what do we do with that fact? Because it's not an anomaly. It's not a minority. I don't think. I think more people think that than we might believe, because we are really trained to think that all racialized populations think the same. So yeah, like I just want to uplift the fact that you're bringing that to the table, because that is an entirely different conversation, I think.
Awesome. Kimi, did you have something? And then Will, you can go after.
I suppose it might more be a remark than a question, but in my experience, I found that in order to sort of have a healthy view of self, if we're talking about skin color, labels, and your place in society because of the two, there sort of needs to be a restructuring in the way you position yourself in society. So I've noticed there's a lot of talk about a hierarchy of whiteness being at the top, and then everything kind of falls down. My question is, do you think that race is just inherently formed into a hierarchy, or can we still talk about race, identify with a race, but look at that as more of a spectrum and color wheel, and therefore, do away with the need to eliminate race? Rather, wouldn't it be more of a restructuring? Because I noticed Dr. Carter was talking about racism, racial oppression. That requires the dialogue of race. So I'm guessing in the future we'll still need to bring up the title of race in order to have these discussions. So wouldn't it be more of an issue of a restructuring of the quote unquote hierarchy and sort of laying that out as a spectrum? What do you think? I just would like to know your thoughts to that.
I know for me, sorry, is that Dr. Carter talking?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I feel like I get this this type of question often, and then it signals to me that something, that there's like a gap in like the thing that I'm actually thinking and then how I'm saying it. So I just want to be clear that the ironic part of what I'm arguing for, theory of racelessness and all, is I think that part of the problem with race and how in American society we conceive of race and we talk about race and how this discourse unfolds itself continues to be a misdirection of our efforts and the dialogue and the discourse, so that we're focusing often on race. I think it's ironic because I see headlines all the time, people refuse to talk about race, but that's not true. I think talking about race is actually more comfortable for people because it affirms their own biases or ways of thinking or pride or whatever. And the thing that is too often missed is like the actual talking about the problem, which is not race, is racism, right? And that's part of what allows racism to continue to persist and continue to be unintentionally and intentionally reified, is because we're misnaming the problem, which means we're misidentifying it, which means our focus is like on that thing that's called race. And so part of my efforts is to like, okay, yes, it's ironic, it's theory of racelessness, but really it's a theory of race. And so we have to talk about race because like people have to be educated in this particular like realm in order to have more meaningful dialogue about racism. And like, what does that actually look like? Because the thing I'm thinking a lot about even now is how I define racism myself. I do lean towards a sort of systemic definition of racism. Systemic both because in American society we are taught racism, spaceism. We are taught these things, so it quite literally is systemic in the U.S. And if that's the case, how do we get ourselves out of the quagmire? And I think so long as we continue to misdirect the dialogue, we're not getting at the root, we're looking at the symptoms. If we keep focusing on fixing people's biases, but as Dr. Carter so poignantly said earlier, people are taught their biases. Like it's taught, that's not human nature. People aren't just magically one day looking around and seeing people who are different from them and then deciding to racialize them. That's not a thing. I'm not convinced or persuaded that that's a thing, that's the center of what it means to be human. And if that's the case, then yes, we teach biases, we are taught biases, we learn biases. So wouldn't it make more sense to be more proactive and instead of trying to fix the symptom, which is the biases that we've learned, to go back to the root and try to work from that space and try to really revolutionize, dirty word, revolutionize what education looks starting from like primary school onward, what media portrayals look like, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a way in which race could become a historical concept or be viewed as a historical concept in ways that would be really fruitful in conversation about like racism, right? But that ultimately we deserve a clear redirection to talk about racism in terms of racism, because by talking about race, we have continued to not solve the problem. And one last example I'll give, which this might be redundant. I can't remember if I said this to Brittany, but Coleman Hughes clearly a fan because I mention him all the time. He spoke pretty compellingly about how if we look at statistics of affirmative action at institutes of higher learning, we will find that the policies that focus on race that are then professed to be solving for racism, right, actually help people who are more often than not, they're children of immigrant families or immigrants themselves, they're middle class, they're upper class, get into these institutions of higher learning so that the problem of racism is actually still unchecked. Because if part of the violence of racism is a disproportionate number of racialized Black and brown people are impoverished, a disproportionate number of us have access to proper preventative health care, a disproportionate number of us live in food deserts and so on and so forth, technology deserts, all of those things, none of that is solved by a policy that ironically focuses on race. So that to me is evidence that in some instances, we are misdirecting and misnaming the problem, which is preventing us from actually solving the problem.
Will, do you have a question or a remark?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but like, this is just a great conversation. It is complex though, because like, as I said, like, you know, you almost want like children's, I think, see, at least if they're raised in a diverse community, they see skin color just like any other identity markers. Like there's a whole bunch of different ones, you know, hair color and things like that. They see it, but they just don't attach a lot of meaning to it. And Dr. Carter, as you said, you know, racism is something that's learned. So it's learned perhaps in schools, but also just in society, they see these differences. But I guess my question for the two of you would be like, what's the end goal? Like, what is your ideal situation that you're aiming for with this? Because it is tricky to only talk about race in the concept of injustice and things like that. But so you have to be aware of it, but then also like, I don't know, like not talk about it when it's, or not address it when it's not having to do with injustice, I guess. It's a very complex thing, because then it could take away from like, I'm curious to your thoughts on like racial pride, not ethnic pride, not like pride in being, you know, maybe like, you know, African or being, you know, from a certain, you know, area, you know, but like pride in your race. Like, I'm curious in your thoughts on that. Do you think that that's like a negative? Do you think that's like a response to try and have pride in something that was seen historically for so long to be a negative? I don't know. There's a lot there, but I don't know if there's something in that you can maybe help clear up.
Sure. So I would just say briefly, I mean, race pride, on my view, is an instrumental good. It's not good in and of itself. Right? Race pride only has value to the extent that it has value insofar as it's useful for marshaling resources to combat racism, for anti-racist positions. In terms of what's the end goal, well, so look, I see racism as doing certain sorts of things, right? One way we might put this in the words of one theorist, Leonard Harris, is to say that what racism does is to create necrobeing, right? And what he means by that is to say that racism is a form of imposing death or living death on populations. Right? What racism does is deny you of this very sorts of social resources that Sheena has laid out, right? That you have the inability to create and generate and transfer wealth across generations. That you have a decreased ability to tend to life-saving healthcare, like the sorts of resources that are readily available in the society, but denied to a demarcated population. That you have also some social goods that it's not so easy to sort of get our heads around, but racism denies populations of dignity and honor, right? Racism is a mechanism that makes it possible for someone to kneel on your back for 9 minutes while you scream for your mother and murder you, right? And recently there's been backlash about this, but there's been a whole history in this country where that sort of thing didn't elicit the kind of backlash that it has within the past couple of years, right? Racism denies people of social well-being. And so what is the end view? The end view is to the extent possible, dismantle a specifiable system that denies people of the ability to pursue social well-being. And an important thing to say about the theory of racelessness or racial elimination, whatever we want to call it, is that it by no means claims that the only evil in the world is racism. Right. You get rid of race in the world, on my view, and that doesn't mean that you don't still have subjugation and domination. You just have different forms of subjugation and domination, right? But here's one that we can get our head around and perhaps combat, and I think we should. And that doesn't have to happen to the exclusion of others.
Are you thinking of something else, Will?
No, I'm just chewing on it a lot.
Okay, good. Khadija, you had a question or a remark?
Yeah. And this is going to be the unfolding thought, so bear with me. But in the last year, I've been doing a bit of work with nonprofit because I was seeing just systemic and individual just discrepancies in my background is in classical music, a very elitist brand of music. So as a result, I was very frustrated because, we were doing the same thing where people would be having conversations. Should we be performing works by old dead white guys? What harm does it do? Should we just be accepting random Black and brown students so that our color changed? We don't have Black people on staff. It was all these conversations instead of actually doing something, right? So I was like, well, I just feel like we should just do something instead. And through that, I kind of developed my own sort of philosophy of approaching these conversations and actually putting action behind them. Because to me, I think I do agree with y'all that talking about race over and over again, it's literally like, okay, and what? Like, what does this do? Like, that's my mindset. I'm very like, what is this going to do in the end, in the long run? We can theorize and talk all day long, but like, if we're not actually implementing plans, what is happening? But to me, I think it's not just about a top down of changing systems, but a bottom up approach. For me, the content that I like to create online or the things that I like to do are from a place of asking people to ask themselves questions that they wouldn't typically ask, of asking them to think more critically. Because as much as I just believe that there is a lot of power in the micro, in talking to people on a one-on-one basis. And that's a lot of work. And it isn't as sweeping, I guess you could say. But to me, I think there should be room for both, of a top-down and bottom-up and I think William was talking about this. This just brought up in my mind about teaching in different schools and stuff like that. And how, I guess, and I might have misinterpreted, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but how being in those environments, you're just exposed to different people. So you're not even really thinking about race so much. You're just like thinking about a bunch of different people. And to me, because so many people are in a way kind of segregated, and I should maybe just say white folks are more so segregated because we've talked about redlining and things like that. Certain stats about how many people of color white people will have as friends actually versus like Black people that will have more white friends and whatnot. If you don't have, it's this lack of repeated exposure. If you are not exposed to different types of people in real life, and you're just getting those depictions from literature and the media and stuff like that, then yeah, it is fair to assume that you are going to have a very stifled view of what it means to be a Black person. And I know we've been talking today about, sorry, I feel like I'm all over the place. I know we've been talking today about Black people not being a monolith, and we all have different experiences and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, and maybe this is agreeing more with racelessness, I'm not really sure. I just really do believe in fundamentally teaching a critical perspective of what race is, what impact it's had in our society, and then after the fact, getting to a place where we can, like Dr. Sheena was saying, talk about race as a history, as, oh, could you believe that back in the day we used to like weird, right? Like, because to me, as someone that is non-binary and someone that is queer, that's also a thing that I would love to see, of people thinking, can you believe that we used to have this binary structure that people just had to be men and women, and we couldn't let people weave in and out of these lines. We were like, you gotta be gay or straight, like that's something that, and I said utopia because it kind of is a, utopia, but that is something that would be great to see, of us still living in a world where, yes, we teach people to think critically from the bottom up, about, okay, this is what race was, this is what happened as a result of these things, so that these students that are from primary, middle school, high school, whatever, going through school, have that faculty within them, so that when they get to a place where it's university or something like that, they're already, I don't know how to say this, they're already given the tools that they need to, on an individual level, suss things out and reject these arbitrary definitions, but also then be the people that are in those positions of power to affect real change top down. I hope that made sense. That was a long-winded way of getting to that.
No, that made sense. That's exactly how I feel about my platform. And I know, Khadija, we've had our own conversation on American Shade. And that's what American Shade is about, critically thinking. And I know I talked with Sheena about this. And to get people to critically think, because thinking requires you to wait. And if you get
I love that you said that. Sorry. When you said that in the thing, I literally was like,
I mean, how simple, right? Simple concept. But it causes you to wait. And if people waited before they made assumptions about people on their skin or their race, they would be looking at people with their logical sensing and not their implicit biases.
It's a respond versus reacting. And
Exactly.
the thing that I love most that I heard, and this is from a channel called Costuming Drama, she was like, you're not responsible for the first thought that pops into your head, but you are responsible for your second thought.
Exactly.
That and your response after, and what you do after.
Exactly. And just to piggyback on what you said and what Dr. Sheena is saying, like, it's funny that you're like, maybe I'm for racelessness, and I'm thinking maybe I am too, because like literally I don't want to have the conversation about race, right? Dr. Sheena's like, and cut.
All right, everybody go home.
I think what's important to recognize is that the motivations are similar, right?
That's what I was thinking.
That beautiful vision that Khadija just gave us, right? Like I know, at least for Sheena and myself, but I imagine for lots of people who subscribe to a kind of racial eliminativism, that's the vision, right?
Okay.
And what the motivation is, well, let's take a clear-headed, sober look at the phenomena and mechanisms that impede the realization of that kind of manifestation of humanity. And what do we need to get out of our way for humanity to look more like that? For us to actually have a plural, diverse, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-gendered, non-binary, an open society that allows for full human expression that is complicated by lots of mechanisms that we just put in place because we don't want to see what would happen otherwise.
I have a question, but I have two questions real quick. I love that we are an hour in and Dr. Sheena hasn't even like answered or asked the two first questions, but this is like, I love this so much. But I'm wondering, and this is for you, Dr. Carter and Dr. Sheena. Khadija and I use our platforms in similar ways. We talk about different things, but we also talk about similar things. And we start at a micro level, though, like she was saying, and you guys are more at a larger scale. Do you think both can work at the same time? Do you think that we are conducive into the reality of what you're trying to see with your theory?
I think you overestimate my book sales.
Oh no!
I would definitely say I'm operating at a micro level myself. But that's primarily just the work of an educator, right? I mean, my primary mechanism of exercising any kind of influence and doing anything meaningful is through the lives of the students that I can touch, right? And that's something that happens day to day, one-on-one, in a small, intimate setting. The theory seems grand, but
yeah, that's what I meant. Like
the sharing of it in ways that actually impacts people, that's granular.
Okay. My second question is, so I discussed this in length with Dr. Sheena. I do not operate personally through my racial identity. I do think Black Americans are a particular group because I think that we are being a Black American is racial and ethnic because we cultivated the heritage, the tradition, the culture here in this country. Even though I've done ancestry.com and I know I'm Nigerian and Cameroon, I don't have a relationship with that. Like I can't go over there and find my people, so to speak. Do you think someone like me who does operate within my ethnic identity as a Black American, that only actually makes me more optimistic to move forward and progress with racially reconciling with everyone because of the history and what we've come through and how generation after generation we keep progressing? And my ethnic identity reminds me to push forward, if that makes sense. So, but it also doesn't get in my way to, one, have these conversations, to two, look past people's race and skin, to actively do that, because it's not just white people that have implicit biases, I do as well. And I challenge myself daily not to act upon those. Like Khadija said, it might come up, but what are you going to do after that? And that's what I try to challenge people. Do you think that someone like me, a proud Black American within my ethnic identity, is helpful or conducive, or even the platform of American Shade, knowing a little bit about my background, is helpful with what your vision is with racelessness? Or do you think that actually gets in the way of it?
Sheena, I'll defer to you if you want to go first, but I have something to say, but I'll wait.
I'll ask for both.
Okay. Yeah.
Sheena's like, I've already answered this.
I mean, so one thing I would say is, and I've actually published claims to this effect. The way I see it, so look, race is real on my account, right? I am a Black man, and to me, it would just be insane to deny that, right? But what I have to appreciate is a certain kind of paradox, the way that I see it. That is, it may well be necessary, and I think, in fact, is necessary, to maintain and reify the very category that one means to dismantle for a period of time, right? Because things like racial pride, race consciousness, right? They have an instrumental functionality that is indispensable to advocacy and anti-racism. And so there's a sense in which you have to sort of maintain the category even as and through seeking its destruction in a certain sense. And I see that as paradoxical, but not misguided, right? That is, while I do want to deny that there is an inherent value in racial identity, I do not by any means deny that there is an instrumental value to it.
Okay, I see that. So, Sheena, did you have any other questions? I want to ask this. I think I know everyone's answer, but I think for the viewers, they might want to know everyone's thoughts on this. I'm gonna pose this, and anyone can chime in. Does anyone think that racism can end in America? Silence. Okay, good. Now we can move on. I just want to make sure. I think because with all these conversations, oh my God. Sorry, guys. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, we have
two people. We have two people.
Yeah, I did want to say to Sam and you, Brittany, really quickly, just because it came up when something you said and it reflected on something that Sam had said earlier, right? Sam pointed out to me, well, look, there are people who want to deny that systemic racism is real. And then you said something in asking your question about the amount of racial progress that we've made and how we've continued to make racial progress. I put myself in the camp of folks who want to deny that is the case, right? I think there are certain metrics by which you might think that there's been significant racial progress in this country, but most of them reduce to mere matters of ability to associate. Right. In terms of durable inequalities that track things like the ability to generate wealth, educational outcomes, health disparities, those have persisted for quite a long time and are not significantly on the decline. But we can go to school, we're white folks. Yeah, there's you're right. No. There's different ways, I guess, like systemic racism and I guess interpersonal racism. But I don't want to go. We'll get back to that.
Okay, so sorry, Will and Kimmy. When I asked that question, you guys chimed in, so go ahead. Will.
Okay, yeah, I think it can end. I think that, again, part of it would be in the eclectic mix of the diversity within America is, as I said when I first spoke, is having biracial children. I mean, I think that the fact that you look at interracial relationships, what that's going to do is probably make things a little bit more muddled when it comes to even systemic racism, because everyone's going to be some sort of shade of brown or something along those lines, that it's going to get more and more tricky. And if we're thinking down the road of 3 or 4 generations from now, if conversations like this become kind of more popular, and the divisiveness becomes, we kind of work our way through this crazy social media world and everything like that. We're all so young we're infants with this, connectedness, but if we use it for something positive, I think it is possible. And then with that, it'll just get less and less clear about, like, this category is systemically, oppressed based on these, whether it's with policing or with whatever it might be, because it's going to be more obvious that it's going to be a class issue, which I think is probably, it's largely a class issue. I think is also a part of it. I think that's going to get expanded more. It's going to be more of a focus. Like, clearly it's more of a class issue now, when, in 3 or 4 generations, the amount of biracial individuals is going to be a lot more than it is today, I would say. So that's why I tend to lean in towards that we're going to be able to be a lot less, if not completely getting rid of racism. It's going to be a lot more complex to be racist, because there's so much, weird shades out there, if that makes sense.
To chime in on that, I honestly still think that we do need to have a healthy sense of a geographical grouping that has a certain immutable characteristic. For example, I'm from Uganda, I'm from Kampala. There are certain things in that combination that make up my physiognomy, that make up what I look like, that make up my ethnic appearance. And I think we can't know what the future will hold, but I think as long as groups tend to live in a particular area for a long amount of time, there are going to be certain characteristics that come from that. Now, we're more global these days, and like Will said, we're going to mix and mesh, but I don't think the point of which someone will never show partiality based on immutable characteristics will never come. I don't think it will ever come, rather. Because it's always a heart issue of, I'm unable to judge a person based on their history, their life. I don't know them. I'm going to immediately snap to the patterns of what I see or what I notice within media representation, so on and so forth. My thing is, it's a matter of humanity and the human heart and human identity, and that we are all sort of broken and partial. And so to say that even as we kind of get more like mocha latte in the future, like, I do think we will still have certain differences, just because it's going to take a while. And so to sort of deny those in the meantime, it might be tricky. And I think having that as a goal might kind of put everyone back in a sort of We by Yevgeny Zamyatin type world, where we're all kind of in denial of objective reality. But then how do you address someone who might have done something that was based on judging upon a skin color, for example? Like, what's the label we're going to put to that? Will people then, after everyone's sort of the same spectrum of brown, will there be a differentiation? Will there be a global separation? And we come back to the place of, oh yeah, they're a darker skin color. Oh yeah, they're lighter, and so on and so forth. So I don't think racism can just like naturally come to an end. I do think we do need to build racial resilience where racism isn't given so much power, where someone, calls you a name, or they say that you'll never be anything because you come from this group. I think we need to laugh at that, but not necessarily eliminate it, because the objective spectrum of color, I don't think that will ever go away.
Sam, did you have something? I can't hear you, Sam.
Hello?
Yeah, you're good.
I'm sorry for that. I muted myself.
Oh, no worries. Wasn't me.
If you say so. I'm just kidding. No, so I think depending on, I have two responses to that because of two different definitions of racism that Dr. Sheena mentioned, for example, which is helpful for us to address. So the first being just the general, idea of racism, or just perhaps individual racism, or as some would want to classify it. I think that will absolutely never go away. Even in throughout history, there's always been different forms of partiality or prejudice. That's always existed. Even in Ghana, where I'm from, you have racism between different tribes in Ghana, all black but different. So it's prejudice. Now, it might not be called racism, but so long as when you see someone's name and you know where they're from, there could be that prejudice there. And if that exists for a different tribe or ethnicity, it's going to exist in some ways as well too, for skin color. I don't think that will ever end. It won't end until my Savior Jesus Christ returns and makes all things new. But systemic racism, the way some would define it, that's ended, I would say. Because now this is where how you define it matters. If you define systemic racism based on things like disparities, then I think that's an unhelpful ways of mentioning it, because throughout world history, there've always been disparities. There isn't a single world where there aren't disparities. And even between Black people, right? So we mentioned before that Black people are not a monolithic group, that not all Black people think alike. Well, in the same way, not all Black people live alike as well. So, for example, as a West African, I know very well that in America, my relatives in the States and also in Canada, West Africans are some of the wealthiest people in these nations, right? So, and not just on wealth, even on just all around socioeconomic issues, Black West Africans, or in some cases also East Africans, are doing about as well or more than white people. So I think we have to address that. If we're going to mention that the system is against Black people, well, even when it comes to disparities, you have different kinds of Black people thriving, and then different kinds of Black people not thriving as well. And then, even then, I think defining that is also hard, because what is the system? So I would say that, look, slavery, segregation, that's the system, right? We know, we can identify it's objective. But it seems to me the general understanding, I would say in many ways, the critical race theory and understanding of systemic racism is wholly dependent on subjective views, and then things like disparities, which there are so many factors that fall into that.
And I think, Khadija, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is something that I try to be mindful of in these conversations, because as I said, my parents are Gambian, West African. I was born and raised in the States, though. And so something that I've always tried to keep like a double awareness of is the fact that there is a difference in the way, even, and I know some of y'all will know about this, how Africans in America will see Black Americans. Like that's a whole nother conversation to have. Like even stuff that not my parents, but sometimes my parents will say, I'll be like, but I think the thing that we have to be aware of is just because, let's say, Black Africans will do well in America does not mean that Black Americans are doing well in America. And that's something that I think just to talk about what you were talking about, Sam, to point out, because having lived in Canada and America for America first 15 years of my life, Canada the last 14 years, and like going back to Gambia once in a while, like seeing that it is it's something that I can't readily ignore, like I am aware that like And in Canada, it's a bit different too, the way certain Black immigrants are treated, because Canada, Black Canadians, there's this, never mind, we don't have to go into that. Anyway, I was gonna say as well, in terms of thinking that racism could ever go away, I think we have to be aware of racism's children, you know, like Destiny's Child, racism's children of like the little second cousins or whatever of colorism and things like that, that can seep into this. Because to me, what I always say is systems of oppression never completely go away. They just know how to manipulate and morph. And as well, once you put an ideal out there, it doesn't belong to you anymore. And so when that happens, you know, if we think about, let's say, taxonomy, classifying people in general, that did not start out as a racist principle. It was we are the rulers, we won in this war, we beat you. If you were better human beings, you would have beat us too. So ha ha ha, we won, we are better than you, you know, with Aristotle claiming here, therefore we're gonna take over, we're better than you, blah, 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 blah. When you have racial theorists coming along and categorizing people, then you have Aristotle's original idea of some people are meant to be slaves and some people are meant to be rulers, turning into Black people are meant to be slaves and white people are meant to be rulers and all of this sort of stuff. So I think it is very, going back to like the point of teaching on an individual level, it's not just about teaching thinking critically, but I think it's also about making sure that you are always regulating. And I know that seems so obnoxious because who wants to exist like that? It's exhausting, but like existence is exhausting. And to me, I think about it very matter-of-factly in that way. It doesn't stop me from enjoying my life. It doesn't stop me from having fun. It doesn't stop me from having white friends, you know? But it's just me being aware of the fact that it is a constant learning and relearning. And one of my favorite phrases or sayings in the entire world is that knowing is only rumor until it lives in the muscle. You can know something all day long. We can know that race isn't real. We can know that racism is a systemic oppression against certain groups of people, however you want to define it. But until we put that into practice of actually teaching ourselves to think more critically about this stuff, then it's only a rumor that we all are sitting talking about. Hopefully that made sense, but yes.
Okay.
So if I
go ahead.
could quickly, I was going to say something in response to Sam, and I'm happy to bow out so that Will can get in, because I see in the chat that Will's trying to get in. So look, I would just say in response, if it were the case that the same proportions of Black, brown, and indigenous Americans lived in poverty in the United States as white Americans, the point would be well taken. If it was the case that the maternal mortality rate was the same for Black women as it is for white women or other women of means, the argument would be off the table, right? But I think an important thing to say is that what we deal with oftentimes in the context of the United States is not disparity, but racial disparity, where the racial adjective is important, right? That is, we deal with disparities that one can track along racialized populations, right? That are not equally distributed throughout the population as a whole. And then as regard to the other point, is that, well, like, I think it would be a mistake to think that one, racist systems, if they're in fact systemic, have to operate with 100% efficiency, so that anybody Black who shows up in the context of the United States has to automatically be subject to the system in exactly the same way. Never been the case, right? Even in the systems that one might admit were racist systems, slavery and Jim Crow segregation, it was not the case that every Black American was equally affected by either of those systems. And they're the paradigmatic cases of racism, right? And they weren't 100% efficient. So I think demanding 100% efficiency is just setting the bar way too high. The last thing that I would say is, and this really gets to sort of the philosophy of race sort of issue, right? The only reason why one might assume, I'm suggesting, that we ought to see the same sorts of economic, social, political, wealth outcomes amongst racialized Black folks who have been in the context of the United States for generations versus recent immigrants to the country is because we're building in a biological notion of what it means to be racialized. Right? It's only the case that if you think of me, say a multi-generational Black American, as a member of the same race as the child of recent African immigrants, that you wonder, well, look, why is there this disparity between that? Why isn't there a disparity between this person or that person? Or why is there a disparity between this person and that person? But on the theory of racelessness, that's already a mistaken assumption, right? The idea that everyone who is of African descent is a member of the same race is to buy into a biological conception about what it means to be a member of a race, right? One that the theory rejects.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the point, and it's a great point. The point about how that if I were to agree that there was systemic racism, it would, of course, just as it was throughout slavery and segregation, you would still have Black people thriving within that. That's a fantastic point. I appreciate that a lot. I think, nevertheless, at the heart of it is still see, the issue is with the abolitionists and the civil rights movement. They didn't need to point to disparities to prove racism systemically. They were pointing to the legal system. It was clear, right? So I think it already shows a major difference, a radical difference, when the major evidence that we all point to find racism within the system is disparities. I think that's a major. So we have to ask ourselves, what has led to this radical shift in where we find the evidence? What is it? Right. And I think, the concern that I have is, even if you remove Black Africans from this, you will still find disparities within different kinds of Black people who have been or at least their forefathers have been in America for generations, or in Canada, if you want to, use that example as well. You will find differences. So if we cannot point to a law within the system, if we cannot point to policies within the system, then we're always going to be subject to defining racism. No matter what we try to do for progress, we'll always point to, well, even though we've achieved all these things, or we try to pursue all these things or these policies, because of the consequences of such, they are therefore evidence of this system being racist. So, for example, you have in America, in the Great Society, the War on Poverty, which has been proven historically, ended up actually, though it was aimed as a form of reparations for Black people, ended up making things worse in many cases. So you actually now have disparities within Black Americans and white Americans being worse than it was before the Great Society. So does that mean then that those policies and everything since then have been racist? If we tie racism to disparities, we don't have any other option but to say that. And I think that's the concern that we have here. So if someone can point to a particular law or policy within the system, then I think it'd be helpful in improving racism. But other than that, we're only subject to trying to find evidence on disparities that I think, again, are also very subjective.
Yeah, I mean, point well taken, right? But I mean, that's to suggest that only the most vicious forms of racism are going to be the ones that one is able to recognize or willing to recognize, right? So I would also say this, right? A careful read of King's letter from a Birmingham jail might yield the following, right? So one thing that he's decrying, of course, is the existence of straightforward statutes that sanction legal segregation. But King is careful to say in that letter that some laws are unjust on their face and other laws are unjust in their application, right? Which seems to open the door for the idea that a law needn't be, in the way that the statute is written, overtly racist to have racist effect, right? And if the effect of the implementation of a law or the practice of social policy is that folks who look like me, more often than not, have to send their children to schools where the roof is falling down and they got one textbook to 10 kids, but folks who don't look like me send their kids to very, very different schools, even when we control for education level, income level, and all of these other factors, right? That is, if the disparity at the end of the day is so glaringly racial and not attributable to other social factors. Right? I just wonder about the impetus to then deny that, well, what we have here is some form of racism that may even have systematic effect.
Yeah.
Where at least someone from my position is willing to admit and wants to wholly embrace the idea that, and yeah, this particular system is a whole lot harder to detect than past systems were.
And I appreciate that. Sorry, I don't mean to own this at all, but I think I need to reply to that. I appreciate that. But if it's harder to detect, then how do we detect it, right? If we go back on just disparities, again, there's several factors that play into that, right? So I'm completely willing to agree. I know I'm very much with you that so many policies have ended up disproportionately hurting Black Americans. Absolutely agree with that. But there's a difference between bad policies and racist policies, right? I think that's a major thing that we need to consider. You can have, look, there can be, this is maybe a bad example, but just coming to mind right now. If I learn that it just happens to be that there is a serial killer out there and he's just killed, 5 Black people, I could think, okay, there is a racist serial killer out there. But it could be that this serial killer just happened to be in a neighborhood where there were Black people there, right? Now, all that really matters is it's harming and affecting Black people. Nevertheless, when we put the word racist there, we can, instead of addressing the real issue, the bad policies, we can then focus on the racism aspects, which leads to things either being ignored or being worsened. And I think that's the concern that I have here.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, to counter that, I think, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting anyone or anything like that, when you think about things that are politicized, right? Like the act of, let's say, getting an abortion, the act in itself is not a political act, but we make things political because of our relationship to them. So to me, I think it is very, I understand what you're trying to say of harping on the racism aspect of things can, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, harping on the racism aspect of things can deter us from the basic foundation of, no, this act in itself was wrong. Like, why aren't we talking about the fact that the example you use, this serial killer killed people in general, and that is wrong. Somebody killing other people is just wrong. Why can't we just talk about that? But I think what it does is it denies to other people that are experiencing that racism what it is that they're experiencing, and talking like maybe on a psychological level to deny someone of that. I know people throw around the word gaslighting a lot nowadays, like a little too much in my opinion, but when there's a power in naming things and addressing them, there's something powerful about saying, wait a minute, my boss is, he's not really nice to me, and I don't understand why. My boss is a white man. He's not nice to me. I don't understand why. He's nice to the Black man that works with me. He's nice to the white woman. So I can't say that he's racist, and I can't say that he is sexist because he seems to be nice to those people. But me as a Black woman, for some reason, there's something wrong here, and I don't know what it is. And so to have the term misogynoir, a misogyny against Black women that is specific to the way that I look, and therefore that is why this person feels this way about me, is something that is powerful to have, to know how I can then combat that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I follow you. But even in your example, you're describing a character. You're not describing a result. You're describing a character. You're describing him being nice to white women and him not being nice to you. And I think
I use character. I don't mean like that was just not the best example in the world. Yeah. But go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm just saying that I think if we're going to the word racism comes with, now we might have different definitions of it, but it carries prejudice. It carries a form of animosity for some.
I think that's an individualistic definition. Whereas what I'm understanding is we're not talking about one-on-one, and maybe I shouldn't have even given the example, because we're not talking about one-on-one day-to-day. This person said a microaggression to me. This person called me the N-word, blah, 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 blah. We're talking about a whole system where Black and brown people are disproportionately represented in the prison system, let's say, or we're talking about a whole system where even if you look at an example that I think Dr. Carter brought up earlier about the maternal mortality rate amongst Black women, that is a real issue. And why is it that someone like a Serena Williams has to advocate for herself and her rights because of the systemic oppression of to me, I just think it's less about one-on-one examples. So I'll refrain from using that because that's not really a good way of explaining it, and more so about why the numbers, why stats look that way that they do. And you can blame that stuff, on US in general has not the best maternal mortality rate in general, because there's a whole system about, I don't know, midwives and all that sort of stuff. You could get into that. But at the end of the day, if you look at numbers and the disproportionate rate, it's examining why are people who are classified as this race or this ethnicity or this gender overwhelmingly representing something that is negative and harmful and therefore damaging to generations to go forward of people that look like those people. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
Can we get Dr. Sheena? Go ahead. I think she wants to say something.
Thank you. I just wanted to chime in because it strikes me that as complex as we know all the issues are, I think the tendency often is that we talk about this sort of topic in black and white terms, pun intended. And so it strikes me that there is somewhere in the middle space, the gray space, like somewhere in between the playing fields that we're identifying between the idea that Sam is expressing, which I take to mean to be pretty similar to something I was saying earlier, this need to be more astute in naming and identifying and calling something racist, right? So that we can better solve for the actual problem instead of just indiscriminately labeling everything. And Sam, I might be misinterpreting you, but maybe I'm just projecting my own ideas onto you, but based on what I'm hearing. But I think that there's something to be said about not indiscriminately labeling everything, racist. But I think that there's also something to be said about, for what it's worth, like removing the stigma about what it is to be racist, right? What does it mean for systemic racism to exist, and yada yada yada. I think that there's this like stigma that's attached to it, wrongly or rightly so, is a discussion for another day. That I, in my own work to help people like navigate and lessen to a certain extent, because do I impose my own sort of morality and like moral beliefs and values onto people or systems who are identified as racist? Sure. At the same time, I also recognize how this doesn't come out of thin air. Like it really, part of the problem is the fact that it is institutionalized, it is systemic, whether we want to identify it as being such or not is a different conversation, but like it is. And so part of the fact that it's institutionalized is the fact that then real human beings operate in those systems, right? Real human beings are impacted by those systems. Real human beings are taught to operate within those systems and all of that. And so it's this like really nefarious and vicious cycle. And I think that it doesn't actually help to indiscriminately label everything or everyone or every instance as racist. Like Brittany and I use the example of Sha'Carri Richardson and how that played out. We used that example in our last talk, and we were talking about like how that's it doesn't really do anything to like just label everything indiscriminately as a product of racism. But also to Dr. Carter and to Khadija's points is like systemic racism does exist. And maybe it's the case that you're not compelled by the evidence, Sam, yet. But I would point to the not necessarily the disparities as my primary source of evidence. More so it's how the discourse of race plays out in society, which is really my evidence for the systemic problem. And because I see race as operating nefariously as Dr. Carter does, I identify race as racism, racism as race, yada, yada, yada. And so to me, it's like kind of one and the same. And so very well-intentioned people, not these like evil minions, these devils running around having like racist ideas and stuff. That to me is not indicative of like race and racism. And because I want to say too, like I do extensive work in the Mississippi Delta, and the problems that exist and persist there are definitely at the core of it. It's systemic racism that like leads to the kinds of schools that Dr. Carter was talking about. It's systemic racism that helps those schools still continue to exist in the really abominable ways that they do. And that ultimately that does lead to disparities in outcome. And that's like, to me, we could look at the statistics, we could actually be in the spaces and witness it and feel it. And I don't know, I would be hard pressed, as careful as I am in how I think about these things, how I talk about these things, and how I'm as careful as I am to also always be expanding my views of these things. I would be hard pressed to not identify racism as systemic, and that's just what it is. But that being said, I also value and work to exercise the same amount of caution that you're expressing. And so hopefully I've tried to play in like the middle ground, which I see as being there. I don't think it has to be an either or. Yeah. I think it can be both. I think the problems you're expressing, Sam, are accurate and valid, right? And the concerns you're expressing are accurate and valid. And we would do better to think really deeply about that and evaluate our own identification of what is racism and what isn't. And at the same time, my knowledge is also telling me that racism is systemic.
And I appreciate a lot of what you said. Again, not to own this, I don't want to be talking too much, but just as a quick point to this, maybe a final point from me on that issue, is that the same way that we want to be precise in our wording when we say colorblind ideology, and how we say when people say colorblind, they don't really mean that they're blind, from seeing color. In the same way, I want us to be very precise in using the right words on these issues. That racism has a definition. It has a historic definition, and it carries the word prejudice. Now, I know that's for many people that's changed, which I think that's a problem. Nevertheless, that if racism means prejudice, then the evidence for racism should always be based on identifying prejudice within the system. And I think with disparities, once you move on from there, then you've seen perhaps a systemic issue, but you've not yet proven a racial issue. And I think that's my concern, because if we move away from that, then you could have, as a lot of men say, that society is systemically sexist against men, where you see a lot of disparity. For example, 90% of people in jail are men. 90% of murder is against men. So you see so many of these things. So if we tie a lot of this stuff to disparities, we then can't prove anything. Then anyone can make any claim they want. And I think that's so I appreciate much of what you guys are saying, but I still have not seen any evidence of racial of racism within the system. I've seen systemic issues. We all can agree with that. I've just not yet seen a racial basis for that very the problems that we're addressing right now.
Yeah, if I can chime in, Sam, because I think I like what you're saying is a little, kind of aligned with like Thomas Sowell, and he talks a lot about those ideas of like, what other social factors are there so we can actually solve the problems and things like that. But there's in my class I teach about like Supreme Court decisions. There's Plessy versus Ferguson, which is like outright separate, but then there's stuff like Yikwo versus Hopkins was basically it was a way to keep Chinese immigrants from running businesses, but they didn't say Chinese people can't run businesses. They said, if you use these types of buildings, which were disproportionately used by Chinese immigrants, then you can't operate. So it's kind of like I knew someone who ran a bar, and the owners were racist, but they didn't say no black people. They said like you're not allowed to, and they used all this like stereotypical stuff. You can't wear Timberlands, you can't wear a do-rag, you can't wear blah 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 blah. They did all that kind of stuff as a way to like, no, it's not like we don't want black people, but like you know what it is. So I guess my question is, so what I'm saying is, like, I think the way I think about systemic racism, and this would be different than I'm sure other people, is policies that disproportionately negatively affect certain races. So there are white people that are affected by the policy, but just not to the same degree. And then, I heard Coleman Hughes actually say, so the ways to fix it would be to attack those groups. So it's not just policies that'll help, maybe Black or brown Americans, but will help this group, which is disproportionately Black or brown, would be like so that will like be a way to solve it. But my question, I guess, for you, Dr. Mason, would be like, is part of this idea of racelessness would be to, if you take out the race concept, then you can focus on other social factors. Like I mentioned before, like Nigerian immigrants do better on the SATs than white Americans, like a Nigerian American, but American immigrants, than like white Americans. So if you control for like the differences within Black people or the differences within Asian people, because if you're Korean or you're Chinese, very different culture when it comes to like schooling and stuff than if you're like Laotian or something like that, then we can start to focus more on the policy. So is that an offshoot of why you have these ideas, Dr. Mason? Is like, then if we remove race, then we can focus on these other social factors, or no? Because that is a big kind of pushback to like the Ibram Kendi idea of like any disparity is just racism, and that's not true. So there it could be racism, but we don't know because there's a whole bunch of other factors. I think that's kind of, Sam, what you're saying too. Like, it might be racism, but we don't know because there's all of these other factors. It's like any kind of health thing. Do you exercise? Are you having, a steak with a bunch of bread, or are you having a steak with a bunch of greens? Very different when it comes to health, and you got to control for all of that. So I don't know. That was kind of a long thing, but I'm curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question. And hopefully I'm hearing you right. And I suppose how I answer, if you feel satisfied or dissatisfied, it'll let me know if I'm hearing you well. So I've been influenced. The theory of racelessness, I might have coined the phrase. I mean, I don't know if anyone else really like promotes or uses that phrase, but the ideas that I'm espousing are ideas that far predate my existence. And it was really my grappling with not just literature, but grappling with also the production of literature. I focus on African-American literature, and so the production of Blackness through and African-American literature, all of that kind of stuff. And then also parsing out and being very observant of how race discourse and discourse on racism plays out in society. And all of those things led me to identify that there have been different historical moments through very prominent and also ignored African-American intellectuals primarily, who have kind of shown me anyway, that the idea that to undo racism, we must undo race. And it was my recognition of that. I will say Barbara Chase Rabeau was a writer who I was grappling with at the moment. Gail Jones, Lucille Clifton, a lot of writers that Toni Morrison edited while she was at Random House were really making me think about this idea of undoing race as a necessary part to undo racism. And it was from that point where I started like expanding my knowledge and exposing myself to as much as I possibly could. I was connected with Dr. Carter at Howard University. He's my mentor. He was on my committee. He was saying such kind things about me. It trips me out because I'm like, no, like it's all you. It's been a journey for me, but ultimately this theory of racelessness is something that I struggled with myself in embracing. And I expressed that in my conversation with Brittany, and it's true. I struggled with it myself because I had all of these preconceived notions of what I should think, if you will. And I see the marginalization of a lot of the thinkers that I've exposed myself to, their works and stuff, or the parts of people's works like Toni Morrison that's ignored largely in the sort of effort to prop up what is Blackness and by extension what is race. And I saw that the marginalizations of those people's happenings, and like that made it harder for me to actually accept and embrace my own ideas, my own brain. I was battling myself. And I came to the conclusion that what I was seeing, that my eyes were not deceiving me, right? That my ears were not deceiving me, that both how these things play out in literature, how it's played out historically, and how it plays out in contemporary society, I'm not being deceived. I am not on the, I won't even say the word I was going to use. I'm not being deceived. And once you have that kind of conviction, then yeah, you want to share the theory of racistness with everyone, because even if one need not be an eliminativist to actually benefit from this theory of racistness, because it enables people to step outside of the bounds of racialization, to better have more productive and generative discourse on racism, which is a very difficult thing for most people to talk about. We've made it look easy here, I think. We've made it look easy. We've made disagreements look easy. We've made like truly the intellectual differences, even between eliminativists, you know, and people promoting racelessness. We've made that clear and we've made it look easy. But like for the general public, I think it's clear, it should be clear to all of us, at least if we pay attention to all kinds of media, that it's not easy. And why is it not easy? Largely because, as Dr. Carter identified, racialization of populations is always nefarious and violent. And that's it. And there might be some instrumental reasons for appropriating race and for accepting it and privileging it and all that stuff. Definitely instrumental, definitely helped populations survive in this country and elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that one need accept it. And Brittany, you asked a question about can racism end that I never got to answer. And I say, but I did answer in the last podcast. Like I say that yes, it can end, but not in this way of like 100% of racism or racists are eradicated. No, I don't believe that. I think end in terms of the statistical majority shifting, ends in terms of the sort of disparities that we've talked about and disagreed about causing it. I think that those disparities can be, I think that that can become more balanced, and that we could one day point to evidence that, okay, we've turned a corner here. But I think that necessitates the elimination of race and more people being educated about other philosophies and ways of viewing race. Because at the end of the day, something that came out here that I think should be another panel discussion is like, there are intergroup issues. And I might focus on intergroup issues in terms of racialized Black people because I'm a racialized Black person, but there are intergroup issues that are actually promoted and unintentionally upheld within racialized Black communities in the United States that are detrimental to actually overcoming racism. And that should be a subject of discussion. And I think people like Glenn Lowry misidentify it as a Black culture thing. But if you know how I view race, then you know that I would say that Black culture doesn't exist. We're misnaming it. And the thing that they're naming as Black cultural problems are actually what I perceive to be American cultural problems. And that those American cultural problems, to Sam's point, are largely influenced by socioeconomic status and also racialization, right? I see it really as being like intertwined. I see race as really being a class system in America, if I'm being honest. And so these are topics for like further discussion and further debate. But I would say that when we are able to properly name the problem and look at the root of the problem, racism causes race, yada, 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 it would open the door for recognition of actual differences, like the sort of different Asian ethnicities. I don't even know if Will's still here. The different Asian ethnicities that you were mentioning, the different ethnicities that are, correlate with racialized white people, though, and that those differences need not be a violence attached to it. And I think the idea that the elimination of race to eliminate racism would only open the door to all this other, like chaos. I think that is, I think that is actually subscribing to white supremacy in ways that are difficult to perceive and acknowledge of oneself. The idea that we have to operate within race because we're so entrenched. I think that is white supremacy doing its work to keep us divided and conquered, divided both intergroup and divided intergroup. And so I'm with Dr. Carter in that there is nothing actually positive about race. And if we were able to see that more clearly, then this theory of racelessness would be the very clear path forward. And also, whiteness doesn't exist. I want to throw that out there. I focus on blackness because I'm a racialized black person. But if we're being honest, like if we're going to do it, if we're going to go there, Dr. Carter said something earlier about the mistake of racializing people based on perceived biology. He was talking about, at that time, immigrants from Nigeria, Ethiopia, et cetera, coming to the U.S. and being racialized as black and being perceived as black. He said that's a racialization of a person based on biology, which is pseudoscientific, right? That race doesn't exist biologically. So how interesting and how ironic and paradoxical is it that we continue to the one drop rule, this idea of biracial? We need to throw that, Will, bless your heart. We need to throw that in the trash. It doesn't exist. Those calculations, that breakdown of like what is black and what is not was literally only done to keep and to codify and to legalize whiteness, which was assigned power, political, economic, social, etc. And if that's the case, to be white, one must be pure, racially pure. And think about the possibility of that. Look up Charles Chestnut, Gene Toomer. Look these people up and look me in my eyeballs and tell me that they are black. But yet these people are racialized as black because of this one drop rule, which is a racist, conception meant to keep people enslaved. Like y'all cannot tell me, I will never be convinced that we should subscribe to it, that is reality or anything in between, because whiteness doesn't exist. There is no pure race. And the idea that there is a pure race, I think, is white supremacy speaking to us and tricking us into thinking that it's the only way. And gosh darn it, like I'm refusing to
She said, gosh darn it.
I was like, come on, gosh darn it.
I refuse. White people don't exist. And if we're saying they exist as a social construction, I concede that there's a social constructionist thing happening, right? Because people are racialized. But think about what does it look like for blackness not to exist? Sure. But what would it look like if whiteness didn't exist as a category? Truly, like think about that. Because Dr. Carter once told me that, whiteness probably should go first. So like, what does it look like to live in a world where whiteness doesn't exist, or in a country or society? Dr. Carter, I just put you out there. In a society where whiteness doesn't exist.
I'm totally okay with it. I stand behind what I did.
You can't tell me that wouldn't, you can't convince me that wouldn't be actually a really positive thing. I'm sorry.
And I think, Steve, you've been waiting so patiently. This back here. Go ahead and ask your questions. And also, just to say this, so we went over like 30 minutes, but I didn't want to end this this conversation, even though it does have to come to an end. So we'll have final remarks after Steve.
Oh, yeah, don't put me on the spot or anything. Holy cow. No, there's well, I'm afraid I don't know how to do that, but you know, there's so much to unpack because I've been listening to you guys, and I definitely have changed some beliefs that I have. I'm still on the side of racelessness, but holy cow, you guys really covered some really deep, topical conversations here that it's going to take at least me personally a long time to try and decompress it. But you know, I think the couple of questions that I really have is I'm gonna play my role as the average Joe here, okay, and I'm gonna ask you questions that, you know, apply to really, you know, what is the praxis of racelessness? You know, what does it look like in practice, and how do I explain it to my friends in a very simple way, where, for lack of a better terminology, how can I sell this to my friends if they're not going to read the book, or they're not going to listen to your lectures? And is understanding what it is like to be racialized important in that process? Because I don't wake up every morning and say, well, thank God I'm white. Like, I have no concept of what it is to be white, really, until I look in the mirror and I see myself. And there's still a disconnect there between what is necessary to live and what my idea of who I am and who I belong to actually exists within. So I apologize, that's a lot there, but as a last thing, thank you so much for answering all these questions, and I hope I'm making sense, and thank you very much for letting me be a part of this.
Steve, I'm not gonna let you off the hook that easy, because
okay,
you keep professing yourself to be the average Joe, but I don't know that it's so average for somebody to listen to 150 books a year.
Well, I think there's a difference between listening to 150 books and ingesting 150 books.
Yeah, that may be right.
But no,
we just had an occupant of the White House that probably hadn't encountered a book in the last decade. So for somebody to be, you know, making their way in whatever form through 150 of them a year is certainly not something I would describe as
well. And most of them are philosophy. So, like, really quick, I think you'll get a laugh out of this, because I believe that you're, if I remember correctly, you're a professor of philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I had a conversation last year, and I didn't like how stupid I felt. I knew that I knew what I was talking about. I just didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't have the knowledge to be able to explain myself. And I personally, I don't like feeling like the dumbest person in the room. So I decided to dedicate myself to learning and to reading and to philosophy. And instead of starting off with Aristotle, and Plato, I started off right there with Schopenhauer.
Oh.
And every time I tell people that, they're like, "Oh,
that's painful.
Oh, what were you doing?" Like, I mean, he's spitting out like Latin terminology. I'm lost. I got halfway through the book, and I was like, "No, I'm not going to do that." So I went back and I started back at the beginning, like I should have, and I started reading Aristotle and Plato, and I moved my way up through Kant, Kierkegaard, all the way up until Sam Harris. I love Sam Harris, but yeah. So I apologize for taking time away from you answering that question, but yeah, put me on the spot. I'm happy to be put on the spot.
Yeah, no, so I guess in response to your last question, I would say, I'm kind of keying in on the thing that you said. That is, I don't wake up every day thinking to myself, "Thank God I'm white."
Yes. And
I don't know that very many racialized Black people wake up thinking to themselves, "Oh my goodness, I'm Black." Right? But there are poignant moments, right? Like there are times where I have to look at my son and think, unfortunately, it's the case that I could send him out in the world and he might not come back.
Yeah.
So just in terms of well, how do you sell this? And I'm not even sure that you should try to sell it, to folks that you might associate with who don't listen to this lecture, don't read the sorts of books that we write.
It's a figure of speech. I apologize. It's a figure of speech, just only so that I can have conversations regarding this.
But I think
so that I can help spread the word.
digging in some sense on those 2 points, right? That is probably nobody wakes up every morning thinking something about their racialization in a given context, but there are folks for whom their racialization in a given context becomes very poignant for them in moments. And I don't think that that's an experience that needs to escape white Americans either, right? That is, you may not have daily confrontations with privilege or the like, but those things can be manufactured. Right. And one can come to an appreciation of, I'm able to navigate the world in certain ways that other people can't because of a perceived racial disparity between myself and other folks. And then there are probably a plurality of ways that one can come to an appreciation of that. I mean, one, you already do, reading more. I think Khadija, or maybe it was Kimi, was pointing to the fact that, association is a big problem. Who's in your social circle, and also just sort of a general open-mindedness to the idea that for better or for not, we don't all inhabit the same kind of space, we don't all live the same kind of existence, and attention to that can be meaningful and make a difference.
Yeah, one of the things that I started off with was, it was just right after George Floyd was murdered, and I was already reading, and so I was like, you know what, F this, I'm going to start really investing my time in understanding race in America. And so I just happened upon W.E.B. Du Bois, and I remember from his very first book, from the book that I read, The Souls of Black Folk, there were a couple parts in there that really kind of stuck out and really kind of punched me in the face. And one was where he's talking about what is it like to be the problem? Like that struck my heart. Like, I've never had to be asked that question. Right. And then there was the duality of blackness, right? So there's the person you are in public, and then there's the person that you are in private. Or what some people call code switching. I believe that's what it is, isn't it? Is where you change your behavior.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I get the code switching because I think some people do it too. I'm extremely introverted, and when I go out into public, I change a lot of my mannerisms. I change my language, my behaviors. I'm very much more reserved, much more quiet. Like here, I'm a little bit more outgoing. So I can kind of understand, although I'm sure that's a dim perception of what actual code switching is. But I want to understand the experience a little bit better. And you say it can be manufactured. And I'm trying to do that. But there's people out there that are fundamentally good people that don't read books. They don't put in the time. And I have a hard time saying that, I need to leave them by the wayside.
Yeah. No, that's understandable. But I think, you meet people where they are. And there are a variety of ways besides reading Du Bois to just. So here's the thing, right? I mean, on my view, if we were just to stick with Du Bois, right? Even if it's the case that Black people sometimes have to confront something like a question like, what does it mean to be a problem? Locke famously, railed against this, right? I mean, he was like, I'm not a problem. Like, fuck that. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. But,
you said it.
It's done now.
He vehemently denied that his blackness made him a problem.
Right.
And I lost that train of thought because I was worried about my language.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, but just like, a confrontation with that, right? The idea that if it's the case that's an existential question that racialized Black people in this country have to face, it's not unique to them, right? Because if it's the case that they exist as a social problem, they exist as a problem in a social context, and they're not the only participants in and contributors to that context, right? So there's a point of access for everyone who that problem or that social situation bears on. even if I don't come at it from the same perspective that other people who are involved in it come at it from, that doesn't make it inaccessible to me. And that doesn't mean that if I don't come to it with a mind of openness and an understanding of what's really problematic about it, the way in which people are being sort of affected by what's going on at a larger social level, just attentiveness to that can give one access to it, and the ability to see social problems and take them up in a meaningful way doesn't require that I approach them from the position of the one who experiences the most negative consequences as a result of the problem.
I think I understand. Thank you.
I do not want to wrap this up at all. Like, I'm learning so much. I'm up here taking notes.
At some point, we'll all just fall asleep if we.
I know. Like, I'm sure this can literally go on for 10 hours.
Like, I'm bleeding information out of my ear because there's so much going on here that I'm going to be watching this whole thing for days.
It's going to, this is epic, and I am so thankful for this conversation. I want to end with this. There's a lot of questions I want to end with, but that'll be another 4 hours. I want to ask the panelists, what did you learn from this talk from the other panelists on the opposing side of you? And what do you hope that they learned from you? And I say this, and I choose this question because I'm just observing our language, our thoughts, how we're challenging each other in good faith, and how it's like each of us are saying the same thing. We're just saying it differently. Like, our aim is the same. It's just different directions and paths and routes. So that's my question to you. Everyone can answer. Or if you didn't want to answer, it's fine. But I'm just curious on what your thoughts are on that.
I can answer that.
Okay. Go ahead.
So something that I did a lot of research, and I was watching a lot of your videos and Kimi's videos. And all the books that I've read, it seems like there's one fundamental consistent thing, which is how we divide each other seems to be the way in which supremacy, specifically white supremacy, works best. It's almost like that's the petri dish in which it works best, is when we find ways to separate ourselves. So, Brittany, for example, Brittany, you're Christian. I'm an atheist. You're black. I'm white. Right? You live in New York. I live in Utah. It's 102 degrees outside. I'm not going outside right now. You know, I'm sorry?
I said so much differences, yes.
Right, but I'd be willing to wager a fairly substantial bet that you and I are far more alike than we are different.
For sure.
You know, and so the thing that I've learned from this is mostly learning how to identify love, respect, and change my behavior so that not only am I a better person, but I'm a better person within society. Mm-hmm. And gaining all these different, very, very dynamic personalities has been monumentally, like, it's been a gift for me, honestly. Because I think the way that we connect with people more is what's going to get that racial reconciliation done. And I would like to believe that the theory of racelessness is the train that gets us to the end station.
I think what you just said about, like, you being from Utah and I'm in New York, or black, white, and other things, but that we probably might align, like maybe politically or on other ideas that are much bigger than what we look like, is exactly American shade. And I love that you said that. And that's, I don't know if that's something we all need to take away. Everyone here knows this, but the viewers, that is what I hope you take away, that the most diverse part of us is our minds and how we think, not our exterior. That is my number one goal for this platform, is to elevate that. For myself, what I'm going to take away is to look at the theory of racelessness that Dr. Sheena has thoroughly explained, like 3 hours from me here, like thoroughly explained, and because there's no reason why for me to engage with ideas that I might not completely align with or agree with, but to just to sit with them for a little bit before I come to a conclusion of this can't work, so to speak. So what I'm going to do is try my best to look at racelessness less theoretical and more practical, less, hypothetical and more literal. I got to admit it's hard, but I think that we align on more things than I thought we did prior than when we first met in May, June? I don't even know when it was. So that's what I'm going to do. Also, well, no, I'm going to say it because why not? Also, I think what I would hope people that are proponents for racelessness would believe someone like me or Khadija. I want to speak for you, but I'm just gonna speak for you. That one can have a healthy relationship with their identity like I do, and has worked on it for years. That used to have a negative and unhealthy and toxic relationship with my identity because of how I was operating inside of it. But that they can believe that one can identify with being Black or in their ethnic sense, being American, and want the same goals as someone that doesn't identify. I think both can happen at once. I think there is a compromise. I don't think it's a this or. I think it's or this or that. I think it's a combination of both because of what we just demonstrated here. I mean, I really think this is like an iconic conversation, to be honest. I'm just going to say that. Not just because it's on American Shade, but I really do. But I think there's a beautiful compromise that can happen. So that's my takeaways from that. And like Steve, I'm going to be watching this and taking more notes because I've learned a lot. And I appreciate each of you for coming on. So,
Just
and if anyone, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Very quickly, just to repeat what you were saying. Obviously I'm an advocate for racelessness, but don't get me wrong. I say that I am fearfully and wonderfully Black. I love that. I love that God has made me Black. And then also for, Steve, you are fearfully and wonderfully white. That is just as beautiful. I think racelessness doesn't mean the same way that some might misunderstand being colorblind. It doesn't mean not appreciating who God has made us to be. God has designed us with beauty, and I appreciate that, and I love that. But outside of that, guys, I have thoroughly also enjoyed this conversation. This might be the first, I'm not kidding when I say this, this might be the first time I've had a conversation with others on racism where we passionately disagree, and yet no one has gotten canceled just yet. So I love that.
Jury's still out. We don't know what Twitter's gonna do.
We don't know.
You're speaking too soon. Why did you jinx it?
I know.
There's hope in that.
No, but that's great. That's fantastic. I'm truly privileged. I'd be happy to even be listening to this, but to be part of this, I'm grateful for that. So thank you guys for for this.
Yeah, I'll take the opportunity to just express something. I'm filled with gratitude myself. This has been a wonderful conversation. I thank you for having me. At the very least, I've learned that I need to buttress those arguments in favor of systemic racism.
I'm armed and prepared.
And probably at least in articulating a form of racial eliminativism, it's important to be clearer on the front end about the distinction between colorblindness and the position that's actually being advocated, and also just the importance of I think something that kind of got buried in the conversation, but is coming out now, that speaks to what Brittany and Khadija and I think all of us have been saying, is the idea that there's a vision about what would be a good future. You know, what's a future that enables human potential and autonomy. And I think oftentimes it can seem like those of us on the racelessness side are antithetical to that, to those on the reconciliation side. And one of the important things that I think this conversation has borne out is that that's not the case. And that's probably a point that should be emphasized on the front end, rather than kind of getting buried in the conversation a bit. But we got there and we brought it out. So now it's there for
Awesome.
Yeah, I'd say, like you were saying, Brittany, I tend to operate in what I like to call improv rules, which is anyone who's ever done improv knows you say yes and so that you can keep the scene going, because you need to be open to whatever's going to happen so that it can be fun for everyone and blah, 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 blah. And to me, I think wholeheartedly that, yes, I can identify as a Black person and think about that identity and all the things that might stereotypically come with it or not, and the positives and negatives and all of that sort of stuff, and acknowledge that the future of the theory of racelessness could be more of a possibility than I thought going into this conversation. Like I wasn't necessarily completely anti going into it, but I was just kind of like, I don't really understand it. And I think in its name, it can be a bit provocative because, you know, you hear something like racelessness and people are so used to one thing that if they hear that, they're like, what exactly is this? So I think I've come out of this conversation having a much clearer understanding of what this theory is and how it aligns with my values and beliefs and vision for the future. And also just really enjoyed being able to talk to people that I don't agree with on everything and still be able to do that. Because I think we all can have echoed this sentiment that it has just been impossible in popular culture, media, whatever, to see people disagree and disagree respectfully and disagree in good faith. And that's something that I'm also very much an advocate for on my channel. I want people to be able to maybe not have the same perspective as me, even if they watch the whole thing at the end, they don't agree, but to disagree respectfully and just understand that we each have our own life experiences that are gonna, pun intended, color the way we see the world. So, but I'll be here.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, love that ending. Beautiful. So, oh, what?
Oh, did I get to share my?
No, she didn't get to go.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I didn't know. Go ahead. You have the last word on this, and then we're gonna bring on the viewers.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So insert crying happy emojis, right? Because I'm feeling all the vibes and all the feels for everything that's been said so far. I think the one thing that I keep taking away from conversations like these that I've been privileged to, and Dr. Carter's participating especially, is this idea that one can maintain the category even as seeking its destruction. I think that is a really critical differentiation between Dr. Carter's and my own philosophies. He's a social constructionist, eliminativist. I'm a skeptic, eliminativist. So our approach between like construction versus skepticism is different, I think, in important and profound ways. I think that they both get at different parts of the conversation and the problem and in meaningful ways. And I can see how, and I guess I wanted to like highlight and emphasize that moment, because there is a way in which I've said from the beginning, Brittany, that we are not opposing each other in so many, like, I see more similarities in our ideas than not. And I think it's like, yeah, we're opposing, disagreeing perhaps, but in really foundational ways, we agree. And I also think that, and what I'm hoping that participants, but like viewers and panelists alike might take away, is also this idea that not only are we disagreeing respectfully, but that perhaps that disagreement is temporary, right? That knowledge, so long as we're alive, we're always changing, our ideas are always growing and expanding, or at least I hope so, right? Maybe some people say stagnant, but I think at least for us, we've demonstrated, and viewers, we've demonstrated a willingness to learn, right? To learn from each other, to think out loud and learn in that way. And so just as I'm learning to buttress my position in a more effective way, like Dr. Carter said, it is also the case that our disagreement, for all we know, is temporary. But even if it's not, that is like okay, right? So these are the things I'm taking away, and that I'm hoping other people are noticing as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for this, but we're not done yet. We're going to have a quick Q&A. I'm allowing, let's just have 5 people, because last time I was like, let's have everyone, and then we went on for 2 more hours. So 5 people for this Q&A, and who knows, we might do this again. We might have another Q&A, could be longer. But right now I'm going to add to the stream Missy. Hi, Missy. How are you? I think you're muted.
You're right, I was.
Okay, you're good. Okay, you're good. So what, do you have a remark? Do you have a question? Go ahead.
I think I was tonight I was listening way more than I was last night. I heard the other discussion and I had some takeaways, but I think the one question that remains in my mind is, I know the concept of racelessness is kind of like, okay, it's not really real, and it was something that was used to kind of create a division that doesn't need to be. But, and maybe you've already answered this and I missed it, can you help me understand, once we move past the issues that are attached to race, what will we be left with? If we don't have race, what's a constructive way of dealing with things like culture and history once that construct is gone?
Yeah, so Missy, thank you so much for your question. I think I remember you being in the live discussion for part of the first part of the podcast. So for me, my perspective as an eliminativist is one such that I view nothing getting erased with the elimination of race except the violence of racism. And so there's a lot of talk, and there's a lot of ideas around race as part of one's identity. And I feel like that's like another 6-hour conversation. But from my viewpoint, I think that people misidentify cultural things, ethnic things, national things as being race or as being proof or evidence of race, but that it's being misnamed. And so therefore, if we eliminate the category of race, let's say we get to that point, right? It's eliminated. The only thing that is lost is the disproportionate amount of violence that's inflicted by racism. And the things that stay are all of the things that many of us have expressed in our own ways throughout this conversation that we hold dear, which is this sort of, which is more ethnic and more cultural. And so I'm calling for the stopping the conflation of all of those things. And I think the elimination of race, besides removing racism, would then help us recognize the sort of proliferation of ethnicities and cultures that exist even in racialized groups in the United States today. And by that, I'm thinking specifically of how different African Americans are across regions, you know, both linguistically, culturally, so like fashion, like music, art, all of that. I think there would be a proliferated understanding of similarities and differences that doesn't exist as well or isn't as obvious because of racialization, if that makes sense. And I think that for all intents and purposes, I think that reviewing would be a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add quickly. I mean, the short answer is bring on the plurality. Like once you rid yourself of the homogenizing effect of racialization, what you're going to find is in what you used to think of as monolithic categories, a lot more beauty and diversity.
Mm.
Awesome. Was that all you had,
Thank
Missy?
you.
Or thank you for coming on.
Thank you,
Thank
Missy. It's so good to have a face to a name. Be well.
Thank you. All right. So this is unlike last time. Missy was the only one to come on, the viewer. I'm gonna wait for a couple more minutes and see if anyone wants to come on. Let's see.
Let me tell my wife to jump on and pretend she has a question real quick.
Jump in.
I mean, I've got 4 pages of questions if you really want.
Maybe part 2 if there is one. Maybe 2. Well, it looks like maybe no one had anything. Maybe we answered every question people had. But I want to say again, thank you so much to each of the panelists, all 6 of you that were on. You brought insightful commentary needed for this discussion. I sure have learned so much, and I appreciate each and every one of you. I want to thank Dr. Sheena Mason for coming on again on this platform. Always awesome. And if you guys want to follow these lovely people, I'm going to put all the information and social media handles, all that in the description box below. So thank you again for tuning into American Shade, and just love, less shade. Thanks.